Hi there, everyone. This is Beth Wall, the Director of Health Economics and Reimbursement at Olympus. Today, I will be the moderator for today's webinar, and thank you for joining. We are pleased that you are able to attend this Olympus-sponsored webcast entitled Defining the Value of Endocuff-Assisted Colonoscopy for Adenoma Detection. During this webcast, we're going to review clinical, financial, and other economic considerations regarding endocuff-assisted colonoscopy. We have two speakers. Our first speaker will be Kelsey Lavati. She is the Olympus Product Manager for Endocuff, and she's going to start by providing you an overview of Endocuff so that you have a better understanding of the technology, and she'll touch on some of the clinical and financial considerations for this technology as it relates to colonoscopy screening. Next, I'm pleased to say that we have with us our keynote speaker, Tiffany Yu. She is the Associate Director of Commercial Health Life Sciences at Guidehouse. This is a leading health economics consulting firm. Tiffany is a trained economist and an expert in health economics evidence data generation. She has presented her research at international clinical and economic conferences and has authored peer-reviewed articles published in clinical and health services research journals. Her presentation today will review the findings and implications from her recently published study entitled The Cost Effectiveness of Adding Endocuff to Standard Colonoscopies for Interval Colorectal Cancer Screening. I have just a couple of housekeeping notes before we go into the presentations. First of all, the attendee lines for this call are muted during the presentations. If you have questions, please feel free to type in your questions during the Q&A and we'll keep track of them. To ask a question, select the Q&A icon. The Q&A icon can be found to the right of the WebEx screen. If it's not visible, pull down the WebEx toolbar from either the top or the bottom of your screen and click on the three dots and select the Q&A panel and then type in your question. As a reminder about WebEx functionality, while viewing this presentation on your computer screen, it's best to listen to the audio broadcast through your computer speakers. Attendees are muted upon entry, but will be able to submit questions via the Q&A tool. As mentioned, we'll track all the incoming Q&A questions so that they are addressed during the Q&A session at the end of the presentations. You will also have the option of waiting until the end of the Q&A session to ask additional questions. So that's it for the housekeeping. Without further ado, we'll start the presentation, and I'll ask Kelsey to start with her discussion by providing an overview of Endocuff.
All right. Hi, everyone. So as Beth mentioned, my name is Kelsey Lavati, and I manage Endocuff Vision for Olympus. So before we dive into the cost effectiveness discussion, I'd just like to give a brief overview of the device application, just for those of you who may not be as familiar with its use. So what is this product? So to put it simply, Endocuff Vision is a mucosal exposure device that is attached to the distal end of a colonoscope. It's been designed to give an optimal view of the entire colon and improves endoscopic visualization by manipulating the mucosal folds during a colonoscopy. So there are many significant benefits associated with the use of this device. In terms of clinical value, the device provides optimal visualization, especially when in the hepatic and splenic flexures during withdrawal. It also provides scope stability and increased tip control while performing polypectomies, as well as increased control during the withdrawal process as well. And it's shown to decrease intubation and withdrawal times while still increasing the adenoma detection rate, which can really point to procedural efficiency gains while still achieving the proper visualization needed. And it's also worth noting that Endocuff Vision does have 9 510K approved claims, one of which states that Endocuff-assisted colonoscopy actually results in a statistically significant and clinically relevant improvement in adenoma detection rate in screening, surveillance, and diagnostic populations as compared to unassisted colonoscopy. And so in addition to its proven clinical efficacy, using this device does provide some economic value through its associated downstream revenue as well. Facilities can potentially see an additional revenue stream as a result of decreased surveillance intervals, increased pathology revenue, and higher reimbursements as well. And then lastly, the use of this device is also associated with a reduction in long-term cancer costs. So to dive into this subject matter a little bit deeper, I will now pass it back to Beth to introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you.
So Kelsey, thanks for providing the overview of Endocuff and its value. I think the discussion of Endocuff, aside from its short-term clinical efficiency and economic considerations, also has lifetime considerations, given that this technology offers an improvement over standard therapy in adenoma detection rates and the potential for colorectal cancer interval avoidance. Let's now turn to this discussion over to Tiffany, who can really discuss these findings in more detail. So Tiffany?
Thanks, Beth, and thank you for that introduction. Thanks, everyone, for joining our presentation today. As both Kelsey and Beth mentioned, today I'll be walking through the cost-effectiveness analysis of Endocuff for colorectal cancer screening in the United States. So to start us off, this cost-effectiveness analysis has been published in a peer-reviewed journal. Specifically, it was published in the Clinical Economics and Outcomes Research journal, which is a health economics focused publication. Now, our paper is freely available through open access. Today, we'll be walking through an overview of the analysis, and I'm happy to answer questions following the presentation, but also the details of our publication, of our analysis, are in the publication online if you're interested in taking a look. In terms of my disclosures, I am an associate director employed in the life sciences practice at Guidehouse, and the funding for this research was provided by Olympus Corporation of the Americas. So our cost-effectiveness analysis focused on evaluating the lifetime impact of improving adenoma detection with Endocuff. Essentially, we wanted to figure out quantitatively what does it mean to improve adenoma detection by adding Endocuff to colorectal cancer screening colonoscopies. Based on 5 clinical trials, the adenoma detection rate with Endocuff-assisted colonoscopy was found to be 40%, and that was 14% higher than the standard colonoscopy ADR in those trials, which was 26%. In this analysis, we evaluate the downstream lifetime implications of that increase with Endocuff compared to standard colonoscopy. And in our analysis, we are focusing on screening colonoscopies. As Kelsey mentioned, Endocuff has claims where it can be used in screening, surveillance, and diagnostic colonoscopies. For our analysis, we are focusing on colorectal cancer screening. So these increases in adenoma detection rate have been associated with reduced risk of colorectal cancer when when the adenoma detection rate is increased in screening colonoscopies. Our analysis is model-based, so as an overview of how we evaluate those downstream implications, we quantitatively project the impact of the increased ADR on CRC risk and diagnosis, and the subsequent, therefore, increases in survival, improvements in quality of life, and cost impacts over the patient lifetime due to the CRC avoidance. So our model compared 2 arms. It compared consistent guideline compliant screening over a lifetime with Endocuff versus guideline compliant screening over a lifetime with standard colonoscopy. We evaluated the direct medical costs and health outcomes, and we looked at the costs from 2 different perspectives. Both of those perspectives considered costs over a patient's lifetime on average. The first one is the device purchaser's perspective, and in that perspective, we're focused on the device cost only. The second perspective was that of a fully integrated ACO, and this perspective includes not only the device costs, but also considered the downstream medical costs related to screening and to medical costs for these patients both with and without cancer. In terms of the health outcomes, we evaluated lifetime risk of CRC diagnosis or death, the number needed to treat consistently with Endocuff to avoid those events, and the survival and quality of life in life years and in quality-adjusted life years. Quality-adjusted life years will also known as QALYs, and we'll be referring to them as such in the rest of this presentation. So diving into how we did this, we developed a Markov annual health state transition model, and using that model, we follow patients from screening initiation at age 50 all the way through death. So a Markov model evaluates how patients may transition between different health states. We use mutually exclusive health states, and in the case of our model here, we used 8 distinct health states. They are screening or no cancer, stage 1 colorectal cancer, stage 2 colorectal cancer, stage 3, and stage 4. We also consider remission and death with or without colorectal cancer. We analyze how the patients might transition between those health states on an annual basis, for example, through annual cancer incidence or mortality rates. By applying that data, we're able to track a patient over that entire lifetime where screening is relevant and cancer prevention is also relevant. So our model's pathway was designed to reflect the patient's clinical pathway. And the diagram you see on the screen right now shows how patients can move through our model. So we'll start from the left side. On the left side, you see that there are 2 arms in our model, the top one being the Endocuff-assisted colonoscopy, or the bottom one being standard colonoscopy. In each of these arms, we do assume that the patient is screened using these methods for every screening throughout their entire lifetime, and that they are using guideline-compliant screening. Now, moving a little bit to the right here, the incidence of colorectal cancer among the screened patients is modeled based on real-world U.S. incidence rates by age, the published prevalence and the benefit of standard colonoscopy screening, and the association between increased ADR and decreased colorectal cancer risk as published by Corley et al. In the New England Journal of Medicine. Patients who do not develop colorectal cancer would continue screening at guideline-compliant intervals according to the strategy defined by their model arm. While for those who do develop colorectal cancer, we apply a distribution of stage at diagnosis, and that's based on real-world data for incident interval CRC patients. So you can see here that these patients are then, if they are diagnosed, we apply that data to understand how they're distributed between stage 1 through stage 4 colorectal cancer. For those who are stage 1 through 3 at incidence, we do model that they can progress to stage 4, they can metastasize, and that's based on published rates of distant recurrence for stage 1 through 3 colorectal cancers. Cancer-specific mortality we applied to patients with stage 4 colorectal cancer, and that is also based on real-world data for patients who do have stage 4 colorectal cancer. And all patients who have colorectal cancer are assumed to go to remission if they survive for 5 years without additional progression. And not for all patients throughout the model, we do apply annual non-cancer mortality by age, and that's from data published by the CDC. So in this way, we're able to trace a patient from the beginning of screening all the way through death to capture the lifetime impact of doing screening with Endocuff versus with a standard colonoscopy strategy. I mentioned a few of our inputs on our previous slide, so here we'll go into a little bit more detail. We use data from published literature, from government and real-world databases, and from professional societies to inform our analysis. This included data on clinical data on screening and adenoma detection rates, the epidemiology and progression of colorectal cancer, general and cancer-specific mortality, quality of life with and without colorectal cancer, and the costs for medical care with screening and with or without cancer. Diving into those, as mentioned previously, we have our ADR rates with endocuff-assisted colonoscopy versus standard colonoscopy from 5 clinical studies of endocuff versus standard colonoscopy. The association between increases in ADR with decreases in colorectal cancer risk were from a publication by Corley et al. In the New England Journal of Medicine. I mentioned real-world data informing our analyses. These were used to inform colorectal cancer incidence by age, the stage distribution of incident interval colorectal cancer, and CRC-specific mortality for stage 4 patients by both age and time from diagnosis. These real-world data were from the National Cancer Institute's SEER database and the SEER Medicare linked database. So the SEER database is a national registry of cancer patients in the United States, and we used that to get this detailed data on how patients develop colorectal cancer in the United States. The SEER Medicare linked database is one where patients who have cancer, their SEER registry records are linked to their Medicare claims data, and through that way we're able to confirm that they are incident interval cancers in that they have had previous screening. So moving on to our published data, we found published data to inform the benefit of standard colonoscopy screening, distant recurrence risks by stage for stage 1 through 3 colorectal cancer, and quality of life for these patients with and without colorectal cancer, and by stage and time from diagnosis. And finally, our costs were informed by Medicare data, and that's Medicare data from their fee schedules and from their annual expenditure data, as well as retrospective analyses of claims for patients with CRC. And through that, we're able to get costs for CRC by stage and by time from diagnosis or death. Putting all of that together, we were able to model the incidence rates by age for the standard colonoscopy population and the endocuff screened population. So looking at our graph going from the top down, at the top you see the U.S. population incidence rates, and that's the real-world data from the SEER database. But we know that not all U.S. patients are screened, so we were able to use the prevalence of screening published by the American Cancer Society and the benefit of standard screening from published literature. Using that, we're able to model the incidence rates with the standard colonoscopy screening. Next, once we have that, we were then able to use the increase in ADR from those 5 clinical studies to model the additional decrease in colorectal cancer incidence rates due to that improved ADR when Endocuff is used with screening. So given this decrease in the colorectal cancer incidence rates, the lifetime risk of cancer among for Endocuff screened patients was expected to decrease by an absolute 0.98% with consistent lifetime screening with Endocuff compared to guideline compliant screening with standard colonoscopy. Now, the general U.S. population's lifetime risk has been estimated by the National Cancer Institute at 4.3%. With a 0.98 absolute reduction in colorectal cancer risk, this suggests that the relative risk reduction with Endocuff added to standard colonoscopies would be at least 22.7%. Now, due to that decreased risk with less colorectal cancer, both survival and quality of life were projected to increase. Using Endocuff consistently for screening over the lifetime was expected to avoid one interval cancer for every 102 patients screened consistently over the lifetime with that strategy. And then similarly, in terms of the cancer mortality, consistent use of Endocuff was projected to avoid one colorectal cancer-related death for every 526 patients screened consistently with Endocuff over their lifetime. As context, looking at previous publications by the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force, a report on biennial screening mammographies found that use of biennial screening mammographies would avoid 8 breast cancer deaths per 10,000 screened women aged 50 to 59. And that translates to about 1 avoided breast cancer death per 1,250 screened women. So in context, our analysis projects that consistent use of Endocuff over the lifetime would avoid 1 colorectal cancer-related death for every 526 consistently screened patients. Looking at the cost side of this, from the device purchaser's perspective, the average lifetime cost related to Endocuff devices per patient was expected to be $112 in total on average. Other cost additive aspects would include the increased cost of screening, and that would be due to increased need for polypectomies with increased adenoma detection, increased need for pathology, and increased screening frequencies due to that increase in adenoma detection as patients are potentially moved to a high-risk category and are coming back for screening more frequently. Costs related to cancer-free survival would also be expected to increase as patients would continue to use healthcare over that longer survival even without cancer. However, these increased costs were projected to be counterbalanced by costs related to survival post-CRC diagnosis. So the decreased CRC incidence would lead to savings related to those CRC costs because there are fewer CRC cases expected and less need for cancer treatments. When we account for all of these downstream medical costs from the ACO perspective, in total, Endocuff was expected to be cost savings. The savings associated with avoiding CRC would offset the increases in the costs related to the Endocuff device, the increased costs related to screening or to survival. Looking at both the health outcomes and the costs in context of one another, the Endocuff, our analysis found that Endocuff was expected to both improve outcomes and decrease costs from the ACO perspective. Now, from the device purchaser's perspective, those improvements in clinical outcomes were expected to be cost-effective. The cost per life year or quality-adjusted life year gained were expected to be far below the typical thresholds in the U.S. So in the U.S., we often talk about a $50,000 per life year or per quality-adjusted life year being our cost-effectiveness threshold. It's usually $50,000 is actually the lower end of the thresholds that are commonly discussed in the U.S. Endocuff, our analysis projected that Endocuff would have cost-effectiveness ratios or cost per outcome of $4.4 thousand per life year gained or $9.8 thousand per quality adjusted life year gained, and that's far below the $50,000 threshold commonly discussed in the U.S. Looking at the cost per avoided outcomes, there are no common cost effectiveness thresholds for avoiding CRC cases or avoiding CRC deaths. However, when we look at these ratios, we see that it's $11.5 thousand per avoided colorectal cancer case. Considering the cost of cancer treatment in the U.S., $11,000 to avoid a colorectal cancer case appears that it may be considered cost effective in the U.S. So in summary, our cost effectiveness analysis found that adding Endocuff to screening for patients who are undergoing guideline compliant colorectal cancer screening would be expected to decrease colorectal cancer risk, avoiding 1 case per every 102 patients screened consistently with Endocuff over the lifetime. This is expected to result in both improved survival and improved quality of life for patients on average. And the lifetime cost of the Endocuff device was expected to be $112, and that this would be expected to be cost-effective at common U.S. cost effectiveness thresholds. Finally, when accounting for all of the downstream medical costs from that broader ACO perspective, accounting for screening costs, survival costs, and savings related to avoiding colorectal cancer, Endocuff was expected to be cost-saving overall. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah. So Tiffany, let me just recap. I think this was a good discussion about Endocuff's cost effectiveness. To me, there's important clinical findings. You mentioned the numbers needed to treat, quite remarkable compared to the guidelines for standard mammography. The numbers needed to treat are much lower. Also, there's important clinical findings about the avoidance of CRC cancer, and especially that 22% relative risk reduction that we see with Endocuff compared to standard colonoscopy. But to me, like, the other takeaway is really the avoidance of lifetime treatment costs for those institutions managing the patient beyond standard colonoscopy that really are seeing this patient, and they're going to rely, if this patient progresses, they're going to occur depending on, earlier staging, potentially avoid lifetime treatment costs related to oncology treatments and whatnot when these patients, it's an offset because the patients are detected earlier and they don't incur those cancer treatment costs. I think, too, Kelsey's presentations really provided a nice perspective on the benefits of Endocuff-assisted technology, not only with some of the clinical considerations, but also the efficiency considerations, and also the here and now considerations, around the financial considerations. When you see improved ADR, what are some of the downstream costs associated with it that the hospitals can recoup? So really gave from both of your perspectives, at least in my mind, a full economic perspective, both near and long term. So I thank you for that. I'm sure this was a detailed analysis, the cost effectiveness analysis. So I'm sure that some of you may have questions around it, further questions. It's a lot to take in. So I want to give everyone the opportunity to ask questions. Remember, you should see the Q&A icon at the right-hand top of your screen, and you'll be able to type in a question. So I'm looking for those. Let's start. Tiffany, I just want to ask you a question because I hear this a lot. This was a model. Mm-hmm. Is it based on the results of the clinical study? How should we interpret this?
Yeah. So you're correct. Our analysis is a Markov model. We used the ADR that was used in our model was based on results from 5 clinical trials. Those 5 clinical trials informed the ADRs with Endocuff and with standard colonoscopy. Now, the long-term downstream outcomes were modeled based on that using published data on the association between ADR and colorectal cancer incidence. We then informed additional parts of the model using real-world evidence for real patients who have colorectal cancer. When we do these types of models, we want to take shorter-term clinical trial data and project that over the lifetime to really understand what it means for the patient to have a new innovation applied in their health care. And oftentimes those downstream long-term outcomes can take decades to really measure in a clinical trial. And that's really the benefit we feel for using a model, even though we've rooted in clinical trial data and in real-world evidence.
Yeah. So I think it makes sense when you do most studies, when they're looking at lifetime benefits, choose a modeling approach. Is it an accepted practice? It seems like to do that long-term study, it might be cost prohibitive.
In many cases, models can be extremely useful in those cases where an extremely long-term clinical trial is not only cost prohibitive, but also just it puts new technologies on the back burner for decades, where patients aren't really able, where we're not able to see those results, 20 years from now without a model, unless we were willing to wait 20 years. This model was developed in accordance and in compliance with international guidelines set forth by the International Society for Pharmacoeconomics and Outcomes Research.
I see.
And these methods are used for health technology assessments, internationally.
Okay, so that's good perspective. I hope that answers at least, this first question. So here's another question that came in. Really, you mentioned that $50,000 is a threshold used by decision makers in U.S. and other countries, but mainly U.S. As a threshold, and saying, anything below $50,000 is simply interpreted, it's an amalgam of the clinical effectiveness and the cost savings, but it can be interpreted as anything below $50,000 as simply good value for the money. So what I wanted to know is there anything in your analysis where, in terms of, did you conduct a sensitivity analysis to see if there was anything that tripped that variable on that $50,000? We see that most of the findings were lower than the $50,000 mark. What was the most influential markers for, getting to that $50,000 quality adjusted ratio? I mean, did you find anything in the sensitivity analysis that was compelling?
Mm-hmm. So we ran one-way sensitivity analyses, and that's where we hold all of our inputs constant, but we take one input and we vary it across an individually assigned range for that input based on the uncertainty in that variable. When we varied our everything over those individually assigned ranges, we actually did not find anything that tripped the $50,000 threshold. We varied the ADR across its 95% confidence intervals, and we did not find one that tripped the $50,000 per quality adjusted life year threshold. However, when we also saw that the ADRs were extremely influential on outcomes, so we took the ADR with Endocuff and we reduced it actually below its 95% confidence interval from those 5 trials. We brought it all the way down to 28%, which then represented only a 2.3% improvement over standard colonoscopy. And for context, the base case improvement was actually 14% based on those 5 clinical trials. But when we took the ADR for Endocuff and brought it down below its 95% confidence interval, we were able to create a scenario that did report a cost effectiveness ratio greater than $50,000.
Okay. So just a real world question that I just got, the analysis is very detailed. Not all stakeholders know cost effectiveness analysis. So, question from an account. Who should we contact, if you were to think about this, to bring these findings to the attention within an organization? So, I mean, is it a department administrator? Is it a clinical medical affairs VP? Where do you think we should be discussing this?
So we actually presented this analysis prior to publication. We presented this analysis at Digestive Disease Week. We had quite very many attendees come and discuss our results with us, not only the administrators for health systems, but also the physicians themselves, who are very interested in understanding, we see these clinical trials saying that ADR increases. What does that mean in terms of actual patient outcomes? And that was something that we had some very interesting discussions with the physicians who are actually caring for these patients to understand how does an increased ADR really benefit our patients in a quantitative point of view. In terms of the health administrator perspective, it really depends, I guess, anyone who's really involved in that decision about whether we want to make Endocuff available for patient care, this type of analysis could be useful for, because we are really analyzing several different aspects of the downstream implications, not only those clinical benefits, but also the cost impact. And those pieces, both separately and together, are really influential from several different perspectives.
Yeah, I think, here is a technology where the economics are directly linked to the clinical data. And you can't ignore those compelling clinical results because they actually really do impact the financial findings. So, I do agree with you that there are a number of different decision makers that we have to get this message out to. And again, it's a detailed analysis. Certainly, this is going to be archived so others can hear and hear it once more. The open access publication may help with the decision makers so that they can easily access it and interpret the data and follow up with us on questions. But, it's something that the clinical nuggets really stand out here. When you're looking at lifetime clinical impressions, especially on the avoidance of CRC death, which is quite compelling in giving over 20% relative risk reduction. That's significant.
And to go back to tie this back to your first question, Beth, the question about, well, is this a modeled analysis? How do we interpret this? This is a modeled analysis, but I think something that I hope we were able to communicate through our presentation and through our publication is a lot of the data that we're using to inform it is real-world data. This is really what happens with patients who get colorectal cancer. And so we want to, while it is not a clinical trial that was 50 years long, because that would be logistically very infeasible, we are using very strong data to inform our analysis. And I know we went through quite a bit of analyses of those real-world databases to draw what we felt would be the strongest, most applicable U.S. patient data to inform our analysis. So.
Okay. Let me just look. Just a question. We talked about different types of risk. So, Tiffany, you explained that the findings with the absolute risk reduction versus the over 20% relative risk reduction. Can you go over that again and just what's the difference?
Yeah. So absolute versus relative risk reduction. So I guess we talked about the U.S. population having a 4.3 lifetime risk of colorectal cancer. Just overall, lifetime risk of colorectal cancer is 4.3%. And we said our absolute risk reduction with Endocuff compared to standard colonoscopy was 0.98%. That was absolute. And that means that the 0.98 is on the same scale as the 4.3. So you could say 4.3 minus 0.98. In this case,
yeah.
Yes, the 4.3 is for the overall population, and the 0.98 is the decrease between standard and Endocuff, but they're kind of on the same scale. Whereas a relative risk reduction is how much of the original risk is removed. So it is a proportion of the original risk. Knowing that we said it was at least a 22.7% relative risk reduction because we know that assuming that you all believe that screening is beneficial and decreases colorectal cancer risk, the lifetime risk in the screened population should be less than the overall population risk, so it's less than 4.3. A relative risk reduction, you would take the 0.98 absolute risk reduction and you put it over the lifetime risk in the standard colonoscopy population. If we know that the standard colonoscopy population lifetime risk is less than 4.3, 0.98 over 4.3 is 22.7. Therefore, the relative risk reduction with Endocuff compared to standard colonoscopy must be less than 22.7%.
I see. I'm just doing a time check. We're almost at 15 minutes. before the hour closed. I'm just scanning for other questions. So there's a question, and I'll answer it. There's a question about just insurance reimbursement for the use of the device. And really, and Tiffany, you can pick up on where I'm heading, but really, for both Medicare and commercial insurance, the way the system is set up, the payment for Endocuff is actually covered under the cost of the procedure, whether it's a diagnostic or screening colonoscopy. If the colonoscopy is a diagnostic colonoscopy, there's additional reimbursement beyond the standard screening colonoscopy. So really, the model that you did took into account the existing codes for screening colonoscopy and really incorporated them into the cost into the surveillance. Is that correct?
We use the cost of screening colonoscopies and the cost related to polypectomies, because polypectomies are reimbursed under a different code than screening colonoscopies. So we use the payments for those as our procedure costs for screening.
Yeah. Okay. Let me just see. I just want to give folks just one more shot. If there's any burning question, I think we're almost up on the close of the hour, and I just have some housekeeping questions, but just want to give people a chance. Are there any additional questions? General question, and Kelsey, feel free to chime in also. You know, how can reps help their physician advocates for Endocuff to hospital administrators using this data? I think we covered it a little bit, but, you know, from a marketing perspective, you know, what are your plans, you know, with rolling out this data to really get to the physicians and then to the hospital administrators?
Right. I think because we acknowledge the amount of clinical data that's out there and existing for Endocuff vision, I think it's important to acknowledge that this is one of the only cost-effectiveness studies, at least that we've sponsored. And so I think this really does need to get into the hands of physicians, but also those purchasing directors and those in an influential purchasing kind of role. But I do think that, you know, we can really message on not only the clinical but the financial considerations over the lifetime of the device, and not just in the short term, but the long term as well.
Yeah, I think it's really important, especially like from certain stakeholders. You know, we see more and more hospitals going towards value-based and population management purchasing decisions, right? So this whole model is based on a population perspective, where you're determining over the lifetime management what is good value for the money, right? So it's so important. You know, we see this, it's consistent with AAA, it's consistent with the goals of any accountable care organization that's developing, and, you know, there are many accountable care organizations that look not only on the device costs, which are important, but all of the downstream costs and whether they add cost to the system or they avoid cost to the system. So it's really putting this into perspective, and I think this is groundbreaking research. There are not too many, at least in the literature, cost effectiveness, even looking at standard colonoscopy over the lifetime, models that have been done. And really, when you think of the Corley New England Journal of Medicine findings, really, you know, that potential on ADR to reduce CRC development of interval cancer is there. What this study, it's really a natural segment to take the Corley findings and to bring them to the full lifetime risk. So by that, I call it groundbreaking. And it's something that I think physicians will want to hear about, and also the the hospital administrators, specifically those who are interested in value-based purchasing, like quality assurance managers, the medical teams, the ACO medical directors. This will be very important. So it shouldn't stay just at the department level, but it should be go full circle to everyone in the organization. So with that, I'm just looking at time. It's about 10 minutes of, first of all, I think what I wanted to let you know, we really appreciate everyone joining the call, and especially Kelsey and Tiffany, thank you. It really gave us a full perspective on insights about Endocuff, not only the clinical, the long-term costs, but we've been on that. On behalf of Olympus, I want to thank the audience. I felt they were engaged on the Q&A and really their interest. So really, before we close the webinar, for the audience, we want you to know, I mentioned this, that the webinar is being archived. It will be sent to you soon afterwards, and so that you can share this with others in your organization that may be interested. We mentioned a few stakeholders, but if they're interested in learning more, this is a perfect way to get them up to speed. Also, when you sign up for the webinar, you'll be prompted to take a short survey. It's no more than a minute to collect your feedback. We want to hear from you about what your feedback, what did you learn? It's really your chance to give us feedback, to provide comments on the webinar. You also will have the chance to request further contact with your Olympus sales representatives, so there'll be the opportunity there. So I hope all of you attending enjoyed this discussion, found it informative. I'm going to now close the webinar. Just want to thank you again, and really have a good night, everyone, on behalf of Olympus.